The first time they slipped an envelope under the sacristy door, I thought it was some old clerical prank. Cheap paper, no wax seal, just a single name scribbled in trembling pencil, as if the writer had been afraid to finish it. Over time, I learned the pattern. No signatures, no explanations, no questions. The parish of St. Geronimus of the Fault. That's what we call it, though in the official archives it's listed as deconsecrated, is where those names are delivered and where I conduct the interviews. And it isn't by chance. The church was built upon a vow stone, a slab of black basalt said to have been used centuries ago for oaths of obedience to the heavens. Then came a fire, and in an act of desperation, the bishop excommunicated the building itself, claiming the stone had drawn down something that wasn't light. It survived half holy, half cursed, a contradiction no structure should endure, and precisely because of that, it became useful. No authority above or below claims full dominion here. It's a neutral ground. That's why it has to be this church and no other. Within these walls, a confession is neither command nor heresy. Words carry weight, but not judgment. The higher clergy explain it in a document that doesn't circulate. The church's duty isn't only to banish the fallen, but to understand what breaks heaven's order. The interviews began as a form of containment, knowledge as exorcism. If an angel can speak, it can be categorized, and anything that can be categorized can, in theory, be controlled. My job is to make them speak, to record what makes a being abandon perfection. The official term is Doctrine Recovery Unit, subdivision of celestial deviance. In practice, it's just me, a recorder that hisses, and a table where they sit when they decide to descend. The sessions are scheduled at night, between the last toll of matins and the first silence before dawn. The air always changes first. The candles bend away from the altar, as if the wax itself knows something is coming. The first I ever spoke to called himself Pharrell, though he said that name was already a lie. When he entered, the wind moved as if pulled by memory, not air. His wings were hidden beneath coarse black linen, the first rule, and the shadow they cast didn't match the movement of his body. He sat across from me and waited until I switched on the recorder. "You want to know why we fall?" he said, and it wasn't a question. His voice was metallic, resonant, like iron vibrating underwater. "You think it's pride or lust or some rebellion of fire. It isn't. It's mercy." I asked him to elaborate. The tape caught my voice shaking. "Up there," he continued, "we watch without bleeding. You call it holiness. I call it apathy. I saw them, your kind, breaking, starving, cursing the same name we were forced to praise. I begged to intervene. They said no. They said compassion distorts the design." His words left a static hiss on the recording. Even now, when I play it back, I can hear the faint flutter of wings in the background, though I know the linen never moved. Each angel has a reason, and each reason is a fracture in doctrine. That's why the church keeps these records hidden. Understanding them means admitting that the system fails, that heaven's order is not unbreakable. My interviews are filed away in vaults under the Vatican's Southern Archives, sealed with lead, but I keep copies. I tell myself it's for safety, though sometimes I wonder if it's because part of me wants to listen again to the sound of something divine choosing to become human. Before Rel left, he looked at the crucifix behind me, the one half melted in the old fire. "You think we were cast down," he said softly, "but some of us just walked away." When he vanished, the stone beneath the altar cracked. I swept the dust into a jar and labeled it with his false name. There have been 12 envelopes since then, and I've opened every one. Each name is another fracture, another question heaven refuses to answer. And tomorrow night, I'll ask again. They call it the interview protocol, but it reads more like a ritual. The instructions were given to me by a man I never saw twice, a priest without insignia, wearing gloves too clean for the dirt under his nails. He handed me a stack of onion paper sheets, yellowed and brittle, stamped with seals I couldn't identify. At the top it read, Celestial Subject Containment, Class 3, Verbal Interaction Procedures. Below that, 6 rules. I memorized them, not because I believed, but because belief wasn't required, only obedience. Rule 1. Never write the angel's true name. The name is an anchor, and writing it grants the world a hold on their essence. Rule 2. Never let a tear fall on the recording medium. Human sorrow corrupts divine testimony. Rule 3. Do not look upon the wings directly. What we call feathers are nerves, not symbols. Seeing them unguarded can unmake perception. Rule 4. Do not pray during the exchange. Prayer calls attention from above, and heaven does not authorize these sessions. Rule 5. End the recording before dawn. When sunlight touches confession, the memory burns away. Rule 6. Destroy the copy if the subject mentions the 13th choir. I never understood the last one. Not yet. By the time Morell's words reached the archive, I had already been assigned a second name, Seraphel. The envelope that carried it reeked of ozone and ash, as if it had been mailed through a thunderstorm. I prepared the church as I always did, cleansing with smoke, sprinkling the holy water that had long lost its holiness. Every interview is a reconstruction. I must arrange the altar like a courtroom, but with no judge, no sentence, just the sound of faith collapsing under its own weight. Seraphel appeared differently. No wind, no distortion, just the slow crack of plaster on the walls, like the building itself exhaled. When I turned my head, he was already seated across from me, wrapped in robes of deep gray. No light touched him directly, yet I could see every detail as though the air conspired to outline his presence. "You're not frightened," he said. "I've done this before," I replied. "Then you already know that every interview is a confession for both sides." He didn't smile. They never do. Their faces hold the calm of things that have forgotten time. I pressed the recorder's red button and nodded for him to continue. "I didn't fall," Seraphel said. "I was called down. They said heaven needed witnesses, someone to report how disobedience breeds decay. But I saw no decay. I saw longing. I saw mortals creating beauty out of hunger. I wrote my report, and they sealed it. They said my admiration was contamination." He leaned forward. The temperature dropped. "Do you know what heaven fears, interviewer?" "No. Attachment. Love that doesn't come with command. You call it free will. We call it corrosion." He unfolded his hands, and for a second I saw what was hidden beneath the linen. Not wings, scars. Long, silvered ridges where feathers should have been. I turned away instantly, pulse racing, nausea clawing at my throat. Even a glimpse was enough to trigger vertigo. "They remove our wings," he said quietly, "before we're sent below. Not as punishment, as containment. You'd call it declawing." My notes trembled in my hands. The candles beside us flickered to life on their own, forming a circle of uneven light. "Why tell me this?" I asked. "Because I heard Aurel spoke to you. Because you're compiling what heaven erases. And because you've begun to dream of the choirs." I froze. He shouldn't have known about the dreams, the endless rows of faceless beings, humming in harmony that vibrated through bone instead of air. Seraphel stood, though I hadn't dismissed him. "You think these interviews are authorized by your church? They're not. They were requested by us." I felt my throat dry out. "Us, the exiles, the orphans. We can't return, but we can still speak through neutral ground." And your church agreed, because silence terrifies them more than heresy. They need to believe we still listen. He turned toward the melted crucifix, tracing its warped silhouette with one finger. "Every confession you record chips away at the barrier. Every word drips upward, not downward. Do you understand?" I didn't, or maybe I refused to. When the tape clicked to its end, I found myself alone. The circle of candles had melted into a perfect spiral, the wax crawling toward the altar like veins. I replayed the audio, but his voice was gone. Only a single phrase remained, whispered over and over in static. 13th Choir. I didn't destroy the tape. I should have. But instead I sealed it inside a lead case and hid it beneath the vow stone. Since then, the dreams have worsened. Sometimes I wake to the smell of burnt feathers. Sometimes I hear the pews creak, though no wind moves them. And sometimes, in the gap between waking and sleep, I hear 100 voices breathing in unison, not praying, not singing, just waiting for me to ask the next question. And I always do. They started sending auditors after Sarah fell. Not men in collars, but parish bureaucrats whose shoes never took dust, who smiled without showing teeth. They came at noon when the church was safest, tapped the cracked altar, measured the humidity in the nave, took photographs of the vow stone with a camera that whined and spat light. One of them, a woman with a silver rosary and a voice like a stapler, asked if I had any tapes that warped. She didn't wait for my answer. If you hear the phrase, she said, you have a duty to incinerate. She didn't name the phrase, as if the syllables themselves were a contagion. I told her our duty here was to listen. She said my duty was to help them keep God from answering questions he never asked. Nights returned to their unlit geometry. I learned the body of the church the way a blind man learns a room. The chipped rail at the third pew, the notch in the confessional where someone once carved a date, the cold seam where the vow stone meets common floor. I prepared the space as the protocol demanded, not because the church asked, not because the exiles begged, but because that choreography kept me intact. The bowl of black salt, the linen to drape what should not be seen, the recorder with its ribbon of brown memory, magnetic and mortal. And then I waited, watched the candles bend away from absence, and told myself the work still belonged to us. The third envelope came soft as breath. No smell of ozone, no ash. Inside, the name had been written with a child's hand and then corrected in tiny, careful letters above it. I don't repeat their names. Writing is an anchor, the rule says, and speaking is a promise. But the first scribble, wrong human, haunted me. It meant someone tried to say who this being was, and failed, and tried again. It meant there was a witness before me. He arrived without arrival. The way rain appears on glass without a sound when the storm has been walking for miles and decides you've waited long enough. He wore no linen over his wings, because there were no wings to veil, only the suggestion of absence, a shadow that didn't match his outline. His posture held a tension I recognized from hospital waiting rooms. He sat, and the bench did not creak, and that silence felt like respect. "You have rules," he said, glancing at the onion paper taped beside the altar. We had rules, too. His gaze flicked to the melted crucifix. "Yours allow for betrayal. This place is neutral ground," I said, reciting our defense like a catechism. "Here, testimony isn't a weapon. Not until someone uses it." I pressed record. The tape hissed like breath under a blanket. "The church interviews us because stories compromise abstractions," he began. "Paradise depends on categories: virtue, obedience, merit. But when a category acquires a face, it resists summary. You put a face on failure, you make it grief, and grief is not a sin." His fingers made small shapes in the air, as though he were sorting invisible beads. "Heaven hates grief because it proves attachment. Attachment means you've chosen something specific over perfection, and perfection tolerates no preferences. We fell, not because we desired evil, but because we preferred someone." "Who?" I asked, and heard how fast the word left me. "A girl who prayed with her teeth clenched. A mother who bargained with a God who does not bargain. A boy who kept a sparrow alive through winter." His voice reveled, threaded, grew thin as if passing through cloth. I was assigned to observe the river that ran through a city that did not love itself. The edict was to witness and report. "We do not interfere. We do not touch. We do not touch." He said it again, softer, like something remembered from when language still lived in the mouth. I did. That was the failure. You touched them. I held a door. I warmed a hand. I made a prayer into an answer and told myself it would not matter because it was small. He looked at the recorder with curiosity, not contempt. Your device copies voices onto iron dust. Ours copy destinies onto light. They said I had bent the beam. What happens then? I asked. The same thing that happens here when a priest breaks the seal of confession. He looked toward the confessional carved with that stubborn date. The order prosecutes the individual for revealing that the order is not enough. He asked for water. I offered the chalice and immediately felt ridiculous. He drank from his palm, and the sound of it was under leaves, clean as a small river avoiding stones. You want to know why your church does this? He said. Because if heaven is a machine, then you are its maintenance crew. You oil the doctrine by discovering the points of friction. You update the manual when someone like me exposes a flaw. You tell yourselves it's mercy to understand us. It is, but it's also insurance. If you can predict why angels fall, you can build stronger railings on your stairways. And why do you want it? I asked. Why come here and speak into iron dust? Because heaven deletes our versions of ourselves. If we write our reasons in that light, it unwrites them as a matter of hygiene. He touched the recorder as one touches a sleeping animal. But human storage, ink, tape, scars, survives because it can rot. Rot resists perfection. Your decay shelters us. We sat inside his sentence until it turned into several. He told me about the choirs, 10 names I knew, 2 names I'd only dreamed, and one I refused to hear because the protocol taught me how to keep my structure. He told me there were custodians whose job it was to take the warmth out of compassion before it set, the way a cook schemes fat from broth, to keep it clear. We call them the TH. He stopped. The candles guttered. We call them the listeners who do not sing. They attend to unapproved sympathies. They leave no fingerprints, but they make sure mercy doesn't dry into law. I swallowed the word that wanted to be born in my mouth and beheld the rule as a life raft. Destroy the copy if the subject mentions the choir. I imagined feeding the tape to a steel-bellied incinerator. Imagine the smoke curling up to a sky that would not cough. I pressed the recorder's pause, and when I did, the silence between us widened like a crack becoming a road. You paused, he observed. Good. That's how you keep them from hearing their name echoed. He looked at the pews as if remembering where people used to sit. We learned that from you. Human silence is directional. It doesn't erase, it withholds. He stood, and for the first time, I noticed the way his shadow reached in a straight line toward the vow stone, as if magnetized. Do you know what that stone was for? He asked. Oaths, I said. Obedience. Also annulments. He smiled without teeth, the way the auditors do. People stood on it to marry, and on the same stone to walk away. What your bishop did, excommunicating a building to save a city, was not just hysteria. It consecrated contradiction. This is why this church, not another. Here, orders can be held and released without tearing the fabric. Here, we can say I loved, and the ceiling won't crush us. Something shifted in my stomach. A tide turning in a basin you didn't know was connected to the sea. The air smelled briefly of oranges, then of rain. He bowed to the crucifix as if saluting a soldier who had disobeyed correctly. Will you come again? I asked, and hated the hunger in the question. No, he said, but what I preferred will. He touched 2 fingers to the recorder, and a faint warmth spread into the metal. Listen to your tapes in order, and you will notice the same heartbeat threaded through different voices. Not mine. Yours. Interviewer. Do you truly think you learned our language? Or are you remembering yours? After he was gone, the walls did creak, finally, as if admitting to their own weight. I rewound the tape and pressed play. His speech was intact, then thinned, then briefly doubled by a second track, that didn't exist, my own voice, asking questions I didn't remember asking, in a tongue that tasted like rain on old brass. When the first edge of dawn found the broken window, the last minute of the recording blistered into silence. Rule 5. Sunlight burns confession. It didn't delete. It seared shut. A scar you can touch with your mind but cannot reopen. I cataloged the tape under a false inventory number and slid it beside the others. 12, 13, 14. Numbers that mean nothing but still cannot be harmless. I wrote a note to the auditors and tore it in half. I told myself I would incinerate the reel when the ovens warmed. I told myself a story about duty until it sounded like a prayer. That night the dreams changed. The city of light that bled now dripped upward, defying gravity as if reminded of a promise. In the dream I stood on the vow stone, and someone bound my hands with linen, not as punishment, as containment. "You will interview," said a voice that was the absence of singing. "You will keep listening until you learn what you preferred." I woke with iron taste in my mouth and ash on my tongue. Downstairs, in the nave, a small sparrow had found its way through the broken glass. It sat on the vow stone, head tilted, watching me with the blunt consideration of small things. I opened the door, and it did not fly away. I cupped it, felt the beat like a tiny fist. I carried it outside and held my breath until it decided the sky was still worth the effort. When it went in a straight line toward the east, where the sun burns memory. Back inside, I washed my hands with the water that is no longer holy and dried them on the linen that hides what should not be seen. Then I prepared the church again, not because the auditors required it, not because the exiles hoped, but because somewhere between a system and a preference, ritual is the only boat that floats. I switched on the recorder. I waited. The candles leaned away from what wasn't there, and I asked my next question into the empty air, certain someone I had already loved would come to answer. The last envelope arrived without paper at all, just a feather, folded once, sealed inside glass. It was black, but under light it reflected every color that shouldn't exist. No handwriting, no symbol, only a residue on the surface like fingerprints burned into frost. It should have been nothing more than a trinket, a warning maybe, but when I placed it on the altar, the feather pulsed. The recorder hissed even though it wasn't turned on, and then the bell of St. Geronimus rang for the first time in decades, though its rope had long been cut. That was how I knew the final interview wasn't requested. It was summoned. By then I'd memorized the scent that always came before them, metal and wet stone, and I had learned the rhythm of their arrivals. But that night, the air moved differently. It didn't thicken, it folded. The church went silent in a way that wasn't absence of sound, but the presence of listening. I stood before the vow stone, the only light coming from the candles that leaned away from me, forming a perfect ring. And from the darkness beyond that circle came a voice I hadn't heard in centuries. "Sid Elias," it said. No one had used that name since before I was ordained. The syllables struck something buried in the ribs of memory, a sound that remembered being light before becoming flesh. "I didn't summon you," I said. "You never do." The voice replied. The figure stepped into view, a man-shaped brightness dimmed to bearable levels, wrapped in robes the color of deep smoke. His face was familiar in the way a forgotten prayer feels familiar when whispered again. I realized who stood before me. Not a new exile, not another confession, but the one who had once stood beside me above. My mentor, my commander, the voice that had taught me the language I had thought I was merely learning. "I taught you to ask," he said, studying the feather still trembling in its glass cage. "And you have asked well, but you've mistaken interviews for penance. You were the one who left me there," I said, the old wound breaking open. "When they cast you down, they said your name was struck from the hymns, and yet here you stand." "I was not cast down," he corrected gently. I stepped aside. Someone had to remain close enough to listen, to gather the words you would speak once you remembered what you were. I looked at him. half believing, half afraid of the shape of the truth. You mean the church, this mission, was not theirs to begin with, he finished. It was ours. You think you serve them, Elias, but this structure, these rules, even the vow stone beneath your feet, they were built for a purpose older than the church, a neutral ground where fallen language could survive. Every word you've recorded, every voice you've preserved, carries fragments of what heaven deletes. You are not their interviewer. You are our archivist. The recorder, unspooled on the altar, began to move without touch. Voices bled from the tape. Aurel, Seraphel, the unnamed witness of grief, layered over each other like overlapping choirs, and through them ran one continuous pulse, my heartbeat. I don't understand, I said. If this is all a restoration, what do you need me for? To decide whether heaven deserves to remain intact. He gestured to the melted crucifix. You've heard the testimonies. You've seen the fractures. All that remains is judgment, and you were chosen because you still remember what mercy feels like. I took a step back. I'm no judge. You are the first of us who chose to forget, he said. You wanted to see if obedience could coexist with empathy, so you let them bind your memory, ordain you, teach you to doubt. Every interview was a step toward remembering that choice. My knees weakened. The vow stone beneath me felt warm, pulsing like a slow heart. The candlelight flickered in patterns, not random but rhythmic, Morse-like, deliberate. For the first time I realized the flame wasn't light reacting to air. It was responding to voice, to mine. You're saying I'm one of you, I whispered. You were. You can be again. He reached out his hand. Speak the verdict, Elias. Tell us if the order above should stand unbroken, or if it should fall to the same mercy it forbids. The air thickened. My lungs burned. I could hear the distant bell ringing again, though the sound came from beneath the floor. Every interview, every confession, every word recorded had been building toward this, a trial without witnesses, where judgment was not lightning, but comprehension. I thought of Aurel's quiet defiance, of Seraphel's scarred wings, of the nameless one who preferred a single human touch over eternal silence. I thought of the sparrow that had refused to fly until I opened the door, and I thought of myself, kneeling before an altar I once believed was meant to separate heaven from earth, not reveal that both were built from the same clay. When I spoke, the voice that came out wasn't mine. It carried the weight of every name I'd erased, every fragment I'd preserved. Let fall, I said, not to destroy, to feel. The vow stone split down its center. The sound wasn't an explosion, but a sigh, a release centuries overdue. Light poured upward, not holy, not infernal, just real, dense as water, flooding every fracture of the church. The roof dissolved like paper. The recorder burst open, spooling ribbons of silver through the air, and through the static came the faint hum of 1,000 wings rising. He looked at me one last time. Then you've remembered. And then he was gone. I don't know how long I stayed there. The pews were ash. The altar was gone, but the feather remained, floating in midair, unburned, unaged. I reached out and felt its pulse sync with mine. Outside, the bell tolled once more, not warning, not mourning, just marking time. They will send auditors again, I'm sure. They'll find only ruins, no tapes, no ashes, no proof. They'll write that St. Geronimus of the fault finally collapsed under its own contradictions. But somewhere between the cracks of sound, my recordings still breathe, alive and uncontainable. If they ever listen closely, they'll hear it. A single voice beneath all the others, whispering the same thing over and over. They didn't fall. They descended to remember.